There was only two men in the scriptures who were prophesied to be born at their birth, and that was John the Baptist and Jesus, and that was done in Isaiah. There's going to be John the Baptist. He's the one that's going to be the one that's going to straighten the path that's crooked. He's going to go before the one that I'm sending you, as we know, Jesus. And we know that Zacharias was a priest. We also know when you go through Chronicles, you see what tribe he was from. And this is important to understand if you want to find the birth date of John the Baptist and Jesus. See, in Luke 1:5, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the division of Abijah. His wife was the daughter of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So you see in that verse where John the Baptist's heritage comes from, what priesthood he was of the line of. And if you study some of the old writers like Josephus, he tells you how David set up the order of priesthood, that they had 3 seasons where all the priests had to come into Jerusalem and perform the rites in the temple because there were so many people that came to the feast. So he numbered the Levites. There was 24, to be exact, 24 companies. So now you know where the 24 elders come from. If you want to look in Chronicles 28, you'll see that the sons of Eleazar, Ithar, and the sons of Aaron, he divided them into 24 groups. And then he set up a schedule in the temple of the Lord, this was Solomon's temple, of who was going to preside over the different feasts during the sequences of the years. In 1 Chronicles 24, 7 through 19, it goes and lists all the different priesthood, all 24, and it shows what time of the year they were going to be there. Their tour lasted from Sabbath to Sabbath. As we know, that was 1 week. During 3 festivals, unleavened bread, Pentecost, and tabernacles, they all had to come into Jerusalem. And then you have to start to understand the difference between the calendar that the Hebrews used and the calendars that we use now. The calendars of the Hebrews were based on the moon. That's why they had 29 days and 30 days of the month, which they had to figure out the sequence of every 7 years. They would change it from 12 months to 13 months. So once you start understanding how they arrived at their numbers according to the calendar they used, then if you want to be specific and you want to get the exact dates, this will help your calculations. If you go through what Chronicles says as which priest was responsible at which time and which season, you also had to know the months that the Hebrews used. They all had certain months, March through April, and then April through May, and then May through June. This was the first, second, and third month. And all of these had their priest divided. Verse 23 of Luke 1, so it was as soon as the days of his service were completed that he departed to his own house. Now after those days his wife Elizabeth conceived, and she hid herself 5 months, saying, thus the Lord has dealt with me in the days when he looked on me to take away my reproach among the people. Now in the 6th month the angel Gabriel was sent by God into a city of Galilee named Nazareth. So you see the time frame between when the angel came into Zacharias when he was performing his duty as a priest and told him that his wife was going to bear a son, and then made him quiet, made him mute because he was not going to say things that was going to please God. And at that point, 6 months later, is when Gabriel also visited Mary and she conceived. And if you start doing the math and you put out a chart and you start looking at the chart of when he was a priest, when he went home, when she conceived, roughly, she had the divine conception during the time, roughly, of the Festival of Lights, what the Jews celebrate Hanukkah, which is very interesting because Jesus is considered the light of the world. I find that very interesting. So he was conceived during that time, which is roughly December. So 9 months later, you can see that's in the fall around September when Jesus was born. And there's also calculations that can be done if you find out when Herod was the king. But one of the interesting things about John the Baptist, that his birth coincided with the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And if you remember, in Malachi, it talks about, behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So if you look at what the Jews do even today, when they have their Passover, when they celebrate unleavened bread, they actually set up a vacant plate with a goblet to be filled with wine for Elijah when he is to come at their table. So they're expecting Elijah to come before their Messiah. And it's very interesting that John the Baptist was born in that season between Passover and unleavened bread. All of these feasts is what I believe God uses as time markers throughout the Scripture. The key to understanding the feast is to understand that they were all markers throughout the year. Not only to have the festivals during that time, but it was also a way that God was going to specifically mark very important times throughout history. For example, if you look at the time when Jesus was born, and some believe because of the prophecy given to Daniel that the 483 years that began in 457 BC, you'll see that Jesus was actually born on the Feast of Tabernacles. John the Baptist is born on Passover or unleavened bread. You'll see that Jesus is born on the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, what were the Feast of Tabernacles? Why is that important? Remember, in Isaiah 7:14, look at this. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, if you break down what the term Emmanuel means, it means God with us, and meaning the Son of God has come to dwell with us in a tabernacle, in this physical tabernacle. So the Feast of Tabernacles, as the birth of Jesus, is a way for man to understand, not only is this just a feast, but Jesus is fulfilling every one of the feasts. He comes as our tabernacle. He's tabernacling with man so that in the future, our temple can be inside of his temple. He is our tabernacle. He is our salvation. So as we become born into him, we're actually tabernacling with him. So it makes perfect sense that he was born during that season, which is 5 days before atonement. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles is 8 days. Now, you'll notice that on the 8th day, according to their law, that's when he was circumcised. He was circumcised on a high Sabbath. There's not anything God does that's just coincidence. Everything he does is so perfect and such a design that he can tell Satan in plain sight and in a sound of every power and principality, and there's not one thing they can do to stop it. So not only does he pronounce what he's getting ready to do, but he does it in such sequence and such harmony that even though he lays it out, there's not anything they can do to stop it. And he puts these feasts in such a strategic way throughout the year that if you use those feasts, you can start unlocking very key points throughout the Scriptures.